All right, everyone, talk about burning down the house on your way out the door. Joe Biden attempting to reform the Supreme Court of the United States. It's a DOA. It's not actually going to happen. Throwing it in mainly for electoral purposes. The reforms are threefold. The first would be an ethics code, a binding ethics code for the Supreme Court. Something that actually a majority of Americans do support. I happen not to, because who's going to enforce it? By what methodology? Who's going to write the ethics code? Is it going to hamstring the judiciary? We're supposed to have co-equal government in three parts. It's the separation of powers. Executive branch, legislative branch, judiciary branch. The judiciary was always reckoned to be the most independent of the three, and not without good reason. Have they overstepped their authority many times in the past? Fuck yes, of course they have. So has Congress, especially when they spawn bureaucracy. And certainly so have presidents of the United States. Pretty much every one of them. Some of them have even dared the judiciary at times to bother enforcing their own decisions. Andrew Jackson was one of them, by the way. Another comparison to Trump, except that in the Trumpian sense, they actually they did bind him as much as they could because they wanted to obstruct his policies. The second is term limits. And I strongly oppose this. And by the way, when this article says, well, the majority of Americans support, this is written by Biden, or Biden staffers, by the way, that they support term limits, I don't think that that's true. This is a terrible idea. You're going to have an ever-cycling Supreme Court in which a president can simply stack the court at a whim. It's going to go back and forth between left-wing and right-wing justices, people that are more like registered Republican, registered Democrat. It's going to be all over the place. It's going to be loopy. There's something to be said for having someone on the bench for 30 years, actually. Once they've had enough experience, it makes things a little bit easier. They understand like how the system actually works. It's simply more efficient. By the way, let me pull up the actual article itself. Again, this was, I believe, written by Joe Biden. Archived link in the description. Of course. Joe Biden, my plan to reform the Supreme Court and ensure no president is above the law. Yeah, now that you're on your way out and won't be president anymore, it's really important that the court be constrained more. It's really interesting, the timing of that. And also a constitutional amendment was proposed. I'll read this verbatim. First, I'm calling for a constitutional amendment called the No One is Above the Law Amendment. It would make clear there is no immunity for crimes a former president committed while in office. By the way, that's not necessarily a great idea, Joe, because you will soon be a former president. And it's likely that the reigning president, after you leave, will be someone who you legally persecuted. I don't know that this is the greatest idea, Joe. I'm just saying. It might be a little bit of a mistake. It's not going to pass. There's no possibility of any of these things being imposed. You don't have the votes in Congress, number one. You don't really, at least, you don't have the will of the people, at least in the first two senses. I suppose with the ethics code, you've got a majority support on that one. But again, then you get lost in the weeds, because who's going to, Congress would have to create the ethics code. That doesn't sound like, look at congressional approval. Do people really think that that's a great idea? No, they have stronger approval of SCOTUS, at least in the partisan sense, than they do Congress, in the general sense, in the generic sense. It's funny. People always have, like, there's always like a 40-point negative approval for Congress, and that's usually being generous. And yet they keep re-electing all the incumbents. Like 90% of the time, the person that's incumbent gets re-elected. Vermonters have the same fucking problem. People don't like Phil Scott, but he keeps getting re-elected inexplicably. It could be because he's blessed with having weak opponents, by the way. I think that certainly is helpful. He's a Republican, which is very funny, being a far blue state. But shh, he's actually a liberal. Of course, Republicans here tend to be. Politics is very strange. This is not the answer that we need right now. While it would be nice to have a Supreme Court that was bound by certain ethics rules, you already have financial disclosure and stuff like that. Like they were rambling about Clarence Thomas going fishing on some rich dude's yacht, pertinent to a case that he himself was deciding on at the same contemporary time. Who cares? He's been on the court for long enough. He's nobody's bitch. He knows what he's doing, generally speaking. keep in mind, as a non-conservative, I don't always agree with what the decisions that people like Clarence Thomas or Neil Gorsuch or Amy Coney Barrett would make. Certainly not fucking John Roberts, by the way. The Bush appointee. Cycling the Supreme Court, though, rapid fire is a terrible, terrible idea. You could end up with a hyper-liberal court and then a hyper-conservative court in like the course of 10 years. Well, then they're just going to countermand one another's decisions. And by the way, to the liberals out there, can I please tell you something? The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and the way that Texas functions, by the way, their particular court system, is basically a rubber stamp to punt cases to the Supreme Court. Just like the Ninth Circuit used to be for the liberals, by the way, until Trump overhauled that to some degree. Do you want far-right individuals, which they are, by the way, and not in the sense that I would be conceived of as far-right, like, hey, leave me alone and let me own guns and not pay as much taxes. But we're talking evangelicals, like moralists, so like the more authoritarian so-called right-wing. I don't think there's anything as right-wing authoritarian, of course. They're all left-wing to me. Do you want them to be able to have an incarnation of the Supreme Court, regardless of who the president is, Congress, etc., yada yada, to be able to punt cases up to the top level, get them streamlined, and get them in there in short order in order to create binding legal case precedents? Because I don't. If it's on guns, yeah, go ahead, absolutely. Get rid of the NFA, get rid of all gun control. God bless you, you're wonderful. If it's on taxes, well, you know, technically property taxes aren't legal. That sounds good to me. What if they weigh in on abortion again? So not just ending Roe v. Wade, but saying, abortion, we've decided that it's murder. You're not allowed to get an abortion in the United States. What about if it's on religious liberty? Oh, yeah, Congress can't make a law accepting us as a Christian nation, but we're declaring it to be a Christian nation, or something like that. It doesn't make any sense. It's fucktarded. The idea that you would constrain the judiciary, ironically, could unbridle the judiciary. It could backfire in the most spectacular of manners, as long as the people are carefully chosen by any given incarnation of the presidency. And of course with the will of Congress, of course at the Senate level. And it's completely ex post facto. I mean, Biden is leaving in a few months, and all of a sudden it's important that the judiciary be constrained, and that presidents don't, with the presidential immunity part specifically, with regards to the Supreme Court, which may or may not actually have a chance to go through Congress, depending on who is elected at what level in the next election. That's number one, self-deprecating. I suppose he's like, well, I'm going to croak soon anyway, so I don't care. I'll die before they successfully prosecute me anyway. It's basically a naked attack on Trump on the first level, a naked attempt for the executive and legislative branches to cuck the judiciary on the second, and on the third level, potentially an unbridling of judiciary power. What if the judiciary comes out and says, well, this is unconstitutional? Yeah, you're not going to pass the constitutional amendment. You definitely don't have the fucking votes for that. So if you were to pass an ethics code, they could just say, no, we're just going to ignore the ethics code. Well, it's DOA. Speaker Johnson, by the way, said that. I believe him. The Republicans will hold rank on at least this one thing because they're hopeful about the election. It's just completely stupid. Nothing about this would make any sense whatsoever. Ethics code, on paper, good idea. Oh, we got to hold these people to account. Who's going to hold them to account, and how do you not neuter the judiciary in the process of doing so, and or have the judiciary simply rule that unconstitutional? They can take up the case. Literally, one of the one of the justices could be the litigant. So, you're not going to make it stick. It ain't going to work, dude. That's about all. Peace out.